Novak saw socialism as a unitarian political system which imposes the vision of the few on the many, the opposite of a pluralistic society, which is one of the big themes of the book, right? Yeah, the three spheres that he keeps talking about are competing with one another in a very good way, and that competition creates pluralism, whereas socialism is a unitarian system, the opposite of it. Socialism, in his view, aims at the collapse of the three systems by merging the economic and the political systems together by controlling the moral and cultural one. So what's interesting is that on page 187, for those of you who have the book, you can check that, he says the following. He says, the most unreported fact of our era is the death of socialism. Right? He publishes this in 1981, which is, again, 10 years before Sentis Demosthenes, 8 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is phenomenal in many ways. The question is that true? Is it still true? I'm sure many of you, I was a young student in the late 80s, and I was saying, hurrah, the Berlin Wall fell, this is fantastic. We're done with this chapter of human history, socialism is dead. But is it really dead? It's clearly alive today in North Korea and in China, in that weird beast of state socialism. But it's also on the rise elsewhere, as we know, in the last few years in the West. It's on the rise in the US, notably, especially among young people who see this as a very interesting and desirable, maybe, alternative to liberal democracies. So what Novak calls the ethos of socialism, that is the quest for certainty, the quest for security, and a view or a liking for strict equality, has become an attractive moral view in the West and especially in the US. So that's what I want us to debate today with our three panelists. And I'm going to start with Michael Miller. And let me quote to you, Michael, President Joe Biden, who recently said, and I quote President Biden, "Are we going to continue with an economy where the overwhelming share of the benefits go to big corporations and the very wealthy? Or are we going to take this moment right now to set this country on a new path?" What new path is this? And I believe that democratic socialism is somewhere in the picture. Michael, what do you think? Do you think the interpretation of Novak of socialism is still relevant today?
On socialism, I think there's two things. I think one is when we hear Michael Novak saying that socialism is unknown fact, that it's dead, I think is that no one expected it to die. And he was saying, like several other people, no, it's dying, because he was dying from the inside. I don't know. I mean, I don't think he would be totally surprised that we have a revival of socialism. I mean, maybe a little bit so. I think everyone's a little bit surprised. But I think it's because he had, as many of the speakers have talked about, a real understanding that at the core of this question is, what does it mean to be a human person? We're in an anthropological battle. And so, like, I would say how we think about socialism today and what's happening today are related to those kind of philosophical, anthropological things. And as you mentioned, Fred, it's not just an economic theory. So I would say a couple of things of how we think about socialism and where it is today. So one, Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, said that Marxism was the radical execution of the spirit that still characterizes our age. So even without Marxism, this is the spirit that characterizes our age. And Solzhenitsyn as well spoke this way. And I think Novak is kind of aware of part of this tradition as well. So Ratzinger said, the myth of progress, a technological mindset, which I'll talk about, political utopianism, right? And materialism and the denial of God, Ratzinger said, still characterize Western civilization as a whole. And the great Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce in 1989 said that communism failed in the East because it realized itself in the West. And so I think we've tended generally, and I don't say maybe everybody in the room, but I think there's been a tendency to equate socialism with the economic elements, right? And so, in the 20th century, we said, the Berlin Wall fell and everything's great, and we've won the day. But in fact, as Michael Novak knew, socialism was a much broader intellectual, moral, and anthropological vision of society. And so I think that this first element of would Novak, how would he say, is it dead? I think he saw those seeds going there as well. I think another thing that Novak was aware of is Augusto Del Noce, again, the Italian philosopher, argued that the sexual revolution was the extension of Marxism. And so one of the things that we're seeing now, as Del Noce pointed out, is that when the 1968 student rebellions failed, right? So this was going to bring the age of Aquarius, a new age. We were all going to be happy and everything was going to be perfect. And it didn't deliver, like every single utopian dream doesn't deliver. And so the hippie became the yuppie. And we moved from a Christian bourgeois to a pure bourgeois. Whereas Del Noce describes every single thing becomes an object of trade, right? And that material happiness, materialism is how we're going to make happiness. We're going to acquire things. And by the way, this is an aside, he actually connects it to modesty. The immodesty is part of everything being an object. And so in the shift to the pure bourgeois, we see that the socialists, in a sense, made peace with the market. Now, I don't necessarily mean with free competitive market economies that have been spoken about earlier today. But the socialists, in a sense, made peace with the market, and the market became the funding for the sexual revolution and the cultural revolution. And so you hear this today where we talk about fully automated luxury communism. Okay, if you haven't heard of that, it's a thing. This is what people want, right? So you can smoke weed, get UBI, et cetera. And so, I mean, this is a bit provocative, but in one sense, the socialist of today doesn't want austere, ugly Stalinist buildings, right? They want the orgies of the sexual revolution with, vanilla oat milk lattes that come from capitalist flavor. So it's a really interesting mix of, I think, pure bourgeois, where the goal is productivity and material success, which are Marxian goals. Those are not Christian goals. And so that, as again, Del Noce, and I think Novak would align with this, points out that well-being overtook the good life. So instead of us wanting a good life that Professor Otteson and others talked about, now we just want well-being. Instead of wanting human flourishing, we want humanitarian providing goods and services. And I think then this combines with another thing that Novak was aware of, which is, and you talked about this, Fred, that young people want meaning, young people want purpose. And so as late-stage secularism, gets broader and broader, what we're not seeing actually the increase in atheistic secularism. I would argue we're seeing the re-divinization of the world. We're seeing the rise of irrational religion. And this is also connected to socialism because it has a certain element of kind of spiritual healing the world, right? So Jesus is not a technical Messiah, but socialism is a technical solution to the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death. And so we see this kind of religious element. And of course, Tocqueville predicted that the dominant religion in democracy would be pantheism. And we can see it especially in the environmental movement. Now, again, all these things are incredibly complex. And Fred told me I'm not allowed to talk very long. So forgive my lack of nuance. I know there's a lot more going on than this. And I think we have a tendency today to kind of create like one single narrative that explains everything. And I don't have the talent to do that, nor do I think that's true. But I do think that these are some of the aspects. And so you have this broad socialist, the pure move to pure bourgeois, the religious element, and then we get a techno-utopianism. And as Ratzinger described, this utopian or technical and utopian mindsets are part of the socialist rebellion. And these are merging today into this technological civilization and the pure bourgeois. And so what happens is, for some people, this is great, okay? Techno-utopianism, we're going to use CRISPR technology, we're going to create new men and women, and transgenderism is really a subset of transhumanism. We're going to use technology to transform the person. So in the 20th century, the Tower of Babel was, the Third Reich or the communist paradise. In the 21st century, the Tower of Babel is man himself. We will create new men and women, we'll upload ourselves into the internet, et cetera, and this techno-utopianism rules. Well, it, of course, doesn't deliver. And so you also have, on one side, techno-utopianism, and on the other side, nihilism is knocking at the door, right? This, in a sense, despair. And so I would say, ultimately then, socialism is now at its core element that we are in an anthropological battle of what does it mean to be a human person, what is the good life, and then how do we address it? And I would say that Novak would say, one, we have to focus on what one of his great idols and mentors, John Paul II, the theology of the body. Two, we have to focus on the resurrection, because we get our bodies back. Our bodies are not an accident. Transhumanism is a counterfeit of the resurrection. And that three, that we need to build up, as Lenore and Mary Eberstadt and others talked about, civil society, where we're both deeply involved in politics and in culture. We're 11, but we also create a parallel polis, where we, in fact, exit the broken systems and build new plausibility structures that can, in a sense, rebuild civilization from the inside. So I think Novak then, at the core for Novak's ideas, is the human person at the center of the economy. And in that sense, he may have been optimistic, I think, like Rusty Reno said, but I also think he knew that ultimately that unless Jesus Christ and the human person is at the center of this three-legged stool, and a vision of the human person that values that, then it would not work. So I don't think he'd be totally surprised at what we see today.
Thank you, Michael. I want to turn to Virgil, and especially actually bouncing back off what Michael just said, talking about the techno-utopia that is very appealing to many. And I know you've told me that some of your students find this in some ways, an interesting, at least exercise, mental exercise, right? Could you tell us more about this and the confluence of religion, culture, and that view of the world?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do so. And Michael said a lot of interesting stuff that I'm tempted to respond to instead of your question, but
Go ahead.
I'll restrain myself at least for the time being. But if the surveys are to be believed, right, that the U.S. And certainly youngsters in the U.S. are becoming more certainly anti-capitalist, maybe embracing something like socialism, right? The Pew survey suggests that 2/5 of youngsters, people under 29, have a favorable impression of socialism, and you certainly see some of that in amongst my students. But I think it's more complicated than that, and it's more complicated because regarding what exactly they think they mean when they say they don't like capitalism, and what they think they mean when they say they like socialism. And so for years, I've taught this class in the Honors College at George Mason University on markets and morality. And so we sort of have an extended conversation about, whether or not markets are morally corrupting. And so it's an opportunity in that class to really dig into what they think they mean by capitalism, what they think they mean by communism, by socialism, and why they seem to like one and not the other. And I think some interesting stuff bubbles up when you look at that over the course of the years. One, that the students in my class, by and large, are wealthy. Certainly, many of them from Northern Virginia, which is a wealthy part of the United States. They're certainly wealthy relative to other people in the United States. They're absolutely wealthy relative to other people in the world. And so they certainly, they feel that. Professor Otterson talked about them being embarrassed. There's a kind of embarrassment about that wealth. They're aware, or at least acutely, whether they themselves didn't do anything to deserve being better off than sort of the people that they see on the documentaries that they watch, or that they see in the videos that sort of come across their streams on the various social media. And so they're embarrassed by that wealth. They also, though, weirdly take that wealth for granted. They've been wealthy their whole lives, and the U.S. has been wealthy their whole lives, and so they just sort of assume that they're going to be wealthy into the future. There's not a sense that there's anything that they do that could jeopardize that part of it. That they're annoyed, and I think I would argue rightly so, about cronyism. That they sort of see, the Bernie Madoff story and the sort of series of scandals, and Enron and the series of scandals like that show up, and they think that's representative of what markets are about, and they see. They think that when someone says that they're pro-business or they're pro-market, that they're kind of championing that kind of it and that version of it. That they're disappointed, I think, in institutions generally, that they're disappointed in the schools, which they think have failed them, sort of, and certainly in the post-COVID era, we might sort of want to support that it's failed them, that they're disappointed in sort of series of institutions. And, they don't seem to want something like the elimination of private ownership of the means of production. That's not what's sort of motivating them and driving them, but they don't want what they currently have. And so when they say something like, I'm anti-capitalist or I'm pro-socialist even, what they mean is I'm not this thing, whatever this thing is. It's sort of the constellation of stuff. And they think that by embracing something like socialism, what they're embracing is a kind of solve for the things that the anxieties and the issues that they have with the current system, right? And so it's not, and so I think it's a lot, and I think this is, to go back to Novak, I think this is something that he captured. Because when he said socialism is dead, what he meant was even the socialists aren't advocating for the thing that Marx claimed he wanted, right? Even the socialists aren't advocating for the elimination of private ownership of the means of production. They want something else. And what they want, at least what I think the students that I've encountered seem to want, is sort of an end to all of that messiness that I talked about.
Iqbal, let me turn to you for a second.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Okay. Michael Novak showed there are three, what I did understand is that he showed three worlds, the moral world, the commercial world, and the political world. And to me, we can debate about these things in the first world, namely in developed countries, and try to see how do we turn one, if there is one more dominant than another, how do we bring it to balance? But a developing country, so-called developing country, I, by the way, don't call Bangladesh a developing country. I call it a recovering country because it has gone through a lot of injuries. The point is that how do we actually help it recover? The best way I know is that we cannot actually negotiate between those three pieces, but what lies underneath all of them, all three of them, namely the human person. How can I wake him up more? How can I make him stronger? That is the issue. And then he or she will balance those three elements. And that's what I stumbled upon. And I'll just spend a few minutes on that. So in order to do that, by the way, it's great that to see Lenore Ely earlier in the morning mentioned that Michael Novak understood the effect of communications. And actually, Adam Smith talked about Bengal, which is the English name of Bangladesh, okay? And why it was economically very prosperous. It was very economically prosperous because it was agriculturally extremely strong. And the other is it had 400 rivers. As a result, there's a massive God-given communication facilities which promoted division of labor. This, Adam Smith spent at least 10 pages in The Wealth of Nations on Bengal. So coming back to this, so I realized communication is important. But another very important thing that happened in the early 80s, around the time when Michael Novak published his book, in 1981, the Time magazine published as the man, instead of Man of the Year, it had the the Machine of the Year, which is the computer, personal computer, because it was becoming pervasive. There were all signs that it would become pervasive. And therefore, it became, over time, it became obvious that these computing technologies, to me, just to save time, that it would be very powerful way to empower the individual that lies beneath those three worlds that Michael Novak mentioned. The political world, if people are more economically capable, they can hold their government more accountable. Moral world, we are all preloaded with some moral element. I know Professor Ottenson said that we can train ourselves to be more and more moral. That's true, but we have certain moral elements ourselves. For instance, otherwise, why would children anywhere in the world would enjoy, let's say, Batman or Superman? Because they see evil forces being defeated by the force of good. So this, otherwise, all sorts of storytelling would not work if we did not have that fundamental moral element in ourselves, preloaded moral compass. And of course, the commercial world would prosper more if individuals are trading with each other, the division of labor and all that logic. So this is why I did actually delve into it and created what is now known as Grameenphone. Father Spitzer mentioned it. It now has 80 million customers, about half the country. There are other mobile phone companies that have another 80 million. So overall, almost all adults in Bangladesh have a phone. It used to be, when Michael Novak published his book, there was one telephone company provided by the state, and one person per every 1,000 people had a telephone. Now, virtually everybody has a phone. Maybe some kids don't have it, but maybe some people have two of them, but on average, one person per phone, one person has a phone, one phone in the country. And now they're becoming smartphones. So that is why these devices are like powerful computers. And just like the machine of the year that Time magazine published 40 years ago. Now, there are other ways. The reason I'm bringing these digital technologies is that that's a very clear exhibit of the transition the country has gone through. One is telecommunication, another is television. Television, there used to be one state-owned company. Now there are 30. And by the way, because of the evolution of these things, our Prime Minister is very wise. She created a program called Digital Bangladesh since 2009. And that has helped great deal of digitization of the country. So now there is 100 million people subscribing to mobile banking services, for example. So there's a third industry. And then, of course, there's internet, social media, many other things. YouTube, you can educate yourself on many matters. People are exchanging things with WhatsApp, whatever. So it has a general empowerment of the people, and they're also operating more efficiently. So one macro way of looking at it is that, let's say when Grameenphone started, the country's GDP was 40 billion. Now it's 400 billion. So people are simply operating more efficiently. That's the way it should be. And so I think this has worked. And overall, because of all these industries are now competitive, privately held, I think we have successfully transited from democratic socialism to democratic capitalism.
Virgil, would you say the same about the Bahamas, since you're native of the Bahamas, in terms of the development of the place as well in the last 40 or 50 years?
Yeah, so I'm, as Fred mentioned, I'm a Bahamian. I've also, a lot of my early work was looking at economic culture in the Bahamas. And I want to answer your question, but I want to actually tell a story, because I think it illustrates really nicely the wisdom of Novak on this point, right? That he sort of talked about the market as being the only economic system that could essentially allow for the emergence of a dignified human being, right? That this was essential to understanding what markets were like. And so I want to tell a story about actually slavery in the Bahamas. The caveat that slavery is a horrible institution. I'm not defending slavery. This is not meant as an apology for slavery. This is in no way meant to say anything that's, so that's on the table. But slavery in the Bahamas was this peculiar system. One of the reasons it was a peculiar system was because the soil, it turns out, in the Bahamas is awful and cannot support a plantation economy. It's just not strong. It's not good enough to support a robust plantation economy. And so what you had was in the early 1800s, late 18th century, you had slaves in slaveholders in the Bahamas were forced to figure out a way to feed these human beings who they had enslaved. It was just sort of like this dilemma that they had because they did not have successful plantations from which to feed them with the proceeds. And so what they decided to do was to give them, they allowed them to essentially have use rights over portions of the plantation. They said, oh, you can have this plantation plot, and you can, although enslaved, you can grow whatever you think is appropriate on this little plot, and sort of feed yourself from what you grow. And then they also said, we understand there might be some surplus. On the weekends when you're off, you can participate in weekend markets. Right? And so they had this sort of use rights over parts of plantation. They could sell what they wanted. And that, despite this being in a horrible condition, despite being enslaved, the Bahamians during that period were able to radically transform their lives. That they're living they have a life expectancy during this period that is the equivalent to a laborer in the United Kingdom. They are consuming calories that are 2 and 3 times the calorie intake of people who are enslaved in other parts of the West Indies. They are the archaeological record is finding things in their clothing that they're wearing that is significantly better than the clothing that people are wearing, enslaved people are wearing in other parts of the West Indies. People are finding, the archaeological record is finding trinkets in their cabins that are sort of, again, more sophisticated than the trinkets that you're finding in the cabins of enslaved peoples in other parts of the West Indies. And the historical record is showing that you're seeing that people who, again, just because of this use rights to a portion of the plantation and the opportunity to participate in weekend markets, the historical record showed people buying themselves out of slavery, actually earning enough through their market activities to buy themselves out of slavery, eventually to buy relatives and out of slavery as well. And so you see, just by this sort of little introduction of economic freedom, in the context of a horrible, brutal system that is denying freedom, you get from it a sort of ability for a human being to actually become a human being in a system that is trying to rob them of their humanity, right? And so you get this story, and I think that illustrates really nicely what Novak was trying to get at when he's talking about an economic system that is ennobling and that can allow for, the kind of noble human being. So,
Michael?
Yes, thanks. I think both Virgil and Iqbal, your comments made me think of a number of things I think that are important. So, Virgil, as you mentioned right now, like this economic system that's ennobling, and also you mentioned in your first remarks about how young people kind of take wealth for granted, like it's never going to go away, and Iqbal talked about this move from 40 billion to 400 billion from Bangladesh in this recovery to this increasingly successful place. So at the Acton Institute, I directed a project called Poverty Cure, the father mentioned, and a documentary film called Poverty Inc. And so I was able to do lots of interviews with a lot of people all over the world. And one of the things that was striking is, we tend to think poor people are poor because they lack stuff. But for most people in the developing world, they're not poor because they lack stuff. They're poor because they're excluded from the institutions of justice that we take for granted, like clear title to land, ability to start a business, ability to get your court case heard, just basic access to justice, participation in the formal economy, and the free right of exchange, which is part of the Catholic tradition, St. Thomas Aquinas, 1256, right? And so these things, and I think what's very interesting is a lot of young people today, and a lot of entrepreneurs even, I think a lot of business people, adults in the United States, we take for granted these invisible institutions of justice as if they just kind of showed up from nowhere And no matter what we do, they're going to exist. And I think this is why, I think it was Shakar earlier in the first panel, and I think Kapil and Virgil are making the point. This is why when we talk about Michael Novak's work and we talk about the challenges in front of us today, that we do have to keep in mind the developing world, the recovering world, poverty, and be thinking about how very important this is. And I think Michael Novak also pointed out, at the time when he wrote this book, I directed this film in 2015, and I was arguing against foreign aid. In 2015, it was pretty scandalous to argue against foreign aid, okay? When Michael Novak wrote the book, I mean, you were a pariah of the worst kind because it means you hated all poor people and you wanted them to die, right? But in fact, what we found out is that these large-scale social engineering 20th century mindset of technically trying to solve the problem turned people into objects of charity and compassion, but it didn't treat them as subjects and as the protagonists of their own story of development. And again, I think Michael's analysis, which was very helpful to me and others have talked about, is that it's the human person and institutions of justice. And when the human person is given the ability, like Virgil just talked about, to operate within the institutions of justice, they create prosperity for their own families and their communities. And the challenge, of course, is that we don't take this for granted. And I think you outlined that really well. But I think this is something that super influential in my thinking from Novak and many others, but I think Michael Novak especially.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. Did you want to go?
No, you go.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add that another thing I get from Novak is that it's not just that the economic stakes are high, but the moral stakes are high from this as well. I mean, so when you look at, mentioned that some of the work I do is on markets and morality, that when you say compare market societies to non-market societies on a range of measures that are related to morality, it's stark. That you compare market societies, people in market societies are more altruistic, they're less greedy, they're actually less materialistic, despite the rhetoric around that. They're more tolerant, they're more trustworthy. And so, so things that really matter for us, and there's a couple of reasons I think this is true. That one is that markets are these spaces. We celebrate markets as being these, Hayek says the market is a competitive system where we discover that we discover who to trust in markets as well. We discover something about the moral character of the people that we're interacting in market settings, and that is an important thing that markets add to our lives. The markets are also, a space where we live out our moral values. That markets are a space where we reward people who behave in ways that we think appropriate, and we punish people who we think behave in ways that we think are inappropriate. That's a thing that we play out in our market spaces. It's the only sort of space where we get to carry out our moral projects in that in our economic our lives. It's the only system that allows for that. And the more distorted the market is, the less well it does at playing out those kinds of things, and the less distorted it is, in fact, the more able it is to play out those kinds of things. And so I think the stakes are also high here as well.
We only have 2 minutes and 30 seconds left.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to add the point.
Iqbal, 10 seconds then.
10
Go ahead.
seconds. It appears that we are trying to aid poor countries, but it's really not totally honest. When Michael Novak was writing this book, the East-West conflict was at a very severe point. The point is that this is like you be in our team, not in their team, was the reason the money was being dished out. And it's a kind of imperialism. So we need to keep that in mind.
And can I say we have ideological imperialism now?
Yeah.
Where we're forcing upon like Western secular views on LGBTQ state on poor people and saying, if you don't obey these, we're not going to give you food and food aid and all the other aid. So it continues. The cultural imperialism continues.
I want to mention on page 156, Novak quotes Joseph Sobran, and I quote, "It is no accident, as the socialists say, that socialism and sex or free love came together as advanced ideas that supplement each other. Russian descent Igor Shafaraskevich is, in his profound book, The Socialist Phenomenon, explains that the socialist project of homogenizing society demands that the family be destroyed. So the family and socialism is a really big theme. In 41 seconds, do you think we can say something about this?
Yes, there's 7. Since the beginning, Marx, Engels, Owen, Marcuse, everybody sees the family, religion, private property, and quote, this present form of marriage as an obstacle to social reform. It's completely connected, and that's why we have to resist it.
The book by James Q. Wilson, famous sociologist, he wrote a book called Moral Sense. His point is our moral sense has come mostly from families.
And Primal Screams by Mary Eberstadt.
All right, well, I guess our time is up then. Thank you.
What I want to do tonight is to talk a little bit about how I've seen principled entrepreneurship in my life and how I've tried to follow that example. And so I want to spend a little time talking about that. And the reason I want to talk about it is that hopefully through these stories, it'll encourage all of us to keep sharing our own vision and our own commitment to entrepreneurship and to helping and connecting with other people as well. You are all leaders in whatever capacity you are working in, wherever you are leaders, and people connect with you. They will listen to you, they will watch you, and it's up to us to continue to live our faith in our lives, in every capacity of our lives, so that people can see that our faith is real to us. It's not just something we talk about, it's something that we live every day. So let me give you just a little context here of the experience that I grew up in my life. And I got to talk about my father and his business partner, Jay Venando. So they developed a relationship in high school. Very simple. My dad saw that Jay had a car and he wanted to ride to school. And so he went and said, I'll pay you some gas money. And Jay said, that's a good thing. And they've hit off this wonderful relationship. Dad really enjoyed him. Jay, never took a book home from school and always got A's. My dad never took a book home from school, and he just never took a book home from school. So they complemented themselves in relationships. In fact, my dad would always say that he passed Latin. The Latin teacher said he would give him a passing grade if he promised never to take the class again. And so Dad said, hey, no problem, I can do that. We'll make that work. But they developed this friendship. In the context of this friendship, they would always talk about, they wanted to get in business together. They were entrepreneurs. This is the time coming out of the Great Depression, going into World War II. And they had these ideas, and they would talk together in high school about this. When they went off to World War II, they wrote letters back and forth to each other. Someday this war is going to end. Someday we're going to get in business together. Someday we're going to have a chance to be the entrepreneurs that we want to be. And so I just wanted to give you a little context there about that's kind of the background of what I saw of these of my father and his partner. And so, I want to touch base then on kind of 4 elements that I think are critical and that hopefully are helpful for all of us to think through in our own lives and in our own work, that I saw them demonstrate their whole lives that I've tried to follow and emulate as well. And so hopefully it'll be helpful. So let me kind of just dive in here with the first one that I saw them live, and again, it's kind of coming out of World War II, was this idea of being curious. What does the future hold? And I remember talking to them once, and they had done some videos that said, we just completed a world war. The future was ours. We're looking forward. All the hope that they could ever muster in their lives, they wanted to go forth and move forward and make things happen. They had this spirit of adventure, and they had an attitude that no matter what was happening, it was going to be positive. And this sense of adventure is something that they had in life, and they just kept going forward. And even when things went wrong, they kept going forward. So let me kind of walk you through their early stages here. Their early stages was they got back from World War II. They wanted to start a business. They started a flight school. They wanted to teach people how to fly. The only problem was neither one of them knew how to fly. So you would think if that's going to be your business, that might not be the best choice. So they started down this avenue of teaching people how to fly. The airport in northern Grand Rapids wasn't open yet. They were delayed a little bit, but they had customers that they were ready for. And so they bought floats for the plane, and they put it on the river next to where the airport was going to be, and they taught people to fly off the river. Didn't matter that the airport wasn't open. They still had work to do. They had customers to serve. Well, the airplane business was great in the daytime, but couldn't teach people at night, so they started a restaurant at night, and as they would say, everybody should be in the restaurant business once. So it's the hardest business in the world. So for all of you in the restaurant entertainment business, congratulations and thank you. But it's hard business. They did that for a while. They decided to wrap it up. They read a book about sailing to the Caribbean, and they thought they traded a plane for a boat, actually in Connecticut, right around here, and they decided they were going to sail to South America. And the fact that they had never sailed before didn't, distract them from that either. So they had no idea what they were doing, and if you read their logbooks, you'll just see about the challenges they had all the way going down the coast of the eastern United States. In fact, they got so lost trying to get out of New York Harbor, the Coast Guard couldn't find them. It took them a long time. They said, we've never seen a boat this lost, and they were up in some swamp in New Jersey that they'd found their way into. To literally the Coast Guard said, look, go out here, turn right, see the S on the compass, keep focused on that, and in a few days, if it gets warmer, you're going the right direction. And that's this was their spirit that they went through, and they did great right until they got off to the coast of Cuba and the boat sank. So they got rescued, but their story, as they talk about it, was that you just don't give up. The boat sank, but that never dissuaded them from their desire to travel to South America. They just had to do it differently now. They had this zest, this curiosity, this interest in moving forward and not letting things bother them and not letting things stop them. And I think so often of how many times I allow things to stop me. I read somewhere, and again, it's hard for me to put things together. I'm not smart enough, but I read somewhere, I said the definition of maturity is when you stop being curious. We all have experiences with children, especially the 2-year-olds. Why? Eat your brother. Why? Be nice to your sister. Why? Always asking questions. As we get older, we stop asking questions. We stop being curious. I wonder why. What is it that holds us back? So what other people think of us? So other people feel about us? I want to encourage all of us to stay curious, to keep finding our way forward. So their story, and I'll complete this section. Their story, they come back from the trip. The boat sank. They found their way back. They heard about a business opportunity, a company out of California called Nutrilite. Jay's mom had a cousin who was in this business, and Dad and Jay were always looking for businesses to be an entrepreneur. And Jay said, my mom's got this cousin who's got this business opportunity for us. And my dad said, Jay, he's your cousin, your family. You talk to him. I'm not going to talk to him. I'm going out. Well, Jay did talk to him and said, this business looks pretty good. I think we could do this. So it's 1949. They go to Chicago to go to a meeting. He said it was a huge meeting. All these people from Nutrilite. It's just a huge meeting. There must have been 100 people there. They came back and they said, we're going to make a decision. They made a decision on the way back, said this is a good product. This is a good business. Nutrilite was one of the very pioneers in direct selling and in nutrition and vitamins. So it's a good product, it's a good business. This is what we're going to do. And they just kept working at it all the time. But when you start a business and when you're an entrepreneur, you better be curious because it's not going to go well all the time. You're going to have challenges. You're going to have troubles. So they did Nutrilite for about 10 years. There was a number of challenges with the company and a whole bunch of other complicated things. They said, we like this concept. And that's when they started Amway in 1959. And the rest is history, as Tim kind of talks about the size and the scope of the business from there. but they were always curious. They always had a sense of adventure. The whole idea that we've gone internationally is because they just wanted to travel, so let's take the business there too. There's other people who might have an entrepreneurial idea here too, so let's go. Let's figure it out. My hope is that for all of us, we'll have that same sense of curiosity and what's next. God's got great plans for all of us. We know that. Where will he take us next? And are we curious enough? Are we open enough to his leading to overcome our barriers that hold us back so that we can take the next step forward? Well, the second area I'd like to talk about is this idea of believing in people. That's what I learned. That's what I watched all the time. We believed in people. The idea that the whole idea of Amway is that everybody has an opportunity to have a business of their own selling our products. That's what they do. And there's a lot behind it, and I'm not going to go to explain, but that's the basic idea. And everybody said, you think that idea is going to work? There was a guy who lived in the little town next door to Ada, Michigan, where the headquarters, or where we're from, where we're based. He would drive by the company on a regular basis, going to work in Grand Rapids and little town of Lowell, back and forth. And every day he drove by, he'd say, that thing will never work. And he'd see us build another building, or he'd see it grow. A few years would go by, and he'd keep telling himself that thing will never work. And the only reason we know about it is about 20 years into it, he finally stopped in to see my dad and Jay one day, told him the story, and said, I think it's going to work. And I said, well, thanks very much for telling us that. We appreciate it. But they went in this belief in people. They believed that if you gave somebody an opportunity to have a business of their own, if you just gave somebody that opportunity, people would do something with it. They would take it, they would move it forward, they would make it their own. They would do the things necessary to be successful because so many people are looking for an opportunity. So many people feel stuck in their lives. And we believed in people. One of the early days at a convention in Malaysia, I was in high school at the time and traveled with Dad. We had just started there. We were about 2 or 3 years into the business there. We were having a convention. A few thousand people were going to come to an Amway meeting. And early days in Malaysia, Dad had a chance to meet with the Prime Minister of Malaysia before the meeting. And they had this wonderful conversation about new business coming into Malaysia, investing, and all those sorts of things. But the Prime Minister started to talk a little bit, and he said, it's a tough time in Malaysia. He said, our economy's not good, and the reason it's not good is because our greatest natural resources of copper, tin, and oil are all depressed on the global market, and therefore our economy's really suffering, really hurting, and he kind of went on in that vein. And then he turned to my dad and said, but your business is growing. So you got thousands of people coming to a meeting tonight. He says, I can't get thousands of people to come to a meeting. You got all these people coming. What is it? And my dad said, well, Mr. Prime Minister, you may believe that the greatest resources of Malaysia are copper, tin, and oil. But in our business, we believe the greatest resources of Malaysia are the people of Malaysia. And we invest in people. And we've seen that demonstrated throughout our life. And we've seen people rise to the occasion from all walks of life, from all different backgrounds. In fact, in the early days of business, a lot of consultants would come to Amway and they say, you might want to change this model a little bit. And Dad and Jay would say, well, what do you mean? So you might want to focus your attention on your sales force a little bit. You don't just want to let anybody in here. You got to have some qualifications. You got to have some barriers. They need some sales experience. They got to have good presentation skills. They got to do all these other sorts of things. And whenever somebody would come up with ideas like that, Dad and Jay would say, you can leave now. Because our question was always, well, who are you going to leave out? Who are you going to leave out? Who are you going to deny an opportunity to just because they don't have some experience, just because they don't have great presentation skills? In fact, in the early days, we tried to find people who were terrible presenters. People that would stutter, people that would do other things, that had all these challenges presenting. Why? So that the person in the audience would say, if that guy can do it, then maybe I can do it too. If they can do it, maybe I can do it too. And we believe in people. And that's the whole message of the gospel, isn't it? What Christ did for us. to save us, forgive us from our sins, for God to bring us back to him. So that's been the story of, I think, principled entrepreneurship helps us to believe in people. Well, the third area I want to talk about, we talked a lot about today and here at the conference, is about this idea of free enterprise. You know, I can't dive into it too much further, but we built our business around that, and so much so that, in fact, if you go to the Amway headquarters in front of our facilities in Ada, Michigan, you'll see an exhibit that was actually here in 1964 at the World's Fair in New York. And it was the Hall of Free Enterprise at the World's Fair, the World's Expo at that point in time in 1964, and it was the pillars, the pillars of free enterprise and the whole Hall of Free Enterprise that they bought. We brought the exhibit back to Ada. We wanted to found the business on these principles, on these free market principles, on these ideas, and make them real. So many times when we talk about these sorts of things, they're conceptual. We have a lot of studies and we need all of that sort of stuff, but these are real. Because as you go through these 10 pillars, at the end of the day, the tools of production are with the progress-seeking people. It's the individuals that move us forward. It's the entrepreneurs. It's the risk takers. It's the people who take different decisions, who chart a different path, who are able to move the world forward. And so this idea of free enterprise is something that we'll never move away from. In fact, we began to study it. We began to look around and find out that so many people are desperate for it. We did a study, we partnered with a university in Germany to do a study around the world. It's this free enterprise index we tried to create of how many people would be entrepreneurial, how many people really believe in these ideas. And we found that the number of people who supported and were cheering for it was really high, 60, 70%. We believe in this. And then we found a huge gap. Would you do it? Would you start your own business? Oh, no. Big gap. That they wouldn't start their own business. They wanted to, but they were held back for some reason. And as we studied further, we said, well, why are you holding back? I said, well, first of all, how do I get a product? How do I get the operations? How do I do all these sorts of things? There's just all these business barriers that were in place. And then the third thing they said, well, I got nobody to train me. Who's going to help me? These are ideas and concepts that we tried to put into our business, but these are ideas and concepts that apply, as I was listening to the presentation this afternoon, in some of these institutions, when you can have a justice system, when you can have people in place to provide the right environment that's stable, that allows people to express their entrepreneurial spirit, to express these ideas and do this sort of work. So we believe that those sorts of things are important. Of course, you believe it well. And then the fourth area, maybe just to talk about a little bit, is this whole idea of leadership. There's a learning center, another business in Grand Rapids. They have a learning center, training center, and I was leaving, and I remember looking on the wall as they were praying there. They're saying, nothing changes until the leader changes. And then it's not new or provocative, but it just caught me at that point in time of how important leadership is. Steve and I, my partner Steve Van Andel and I at Amway, we had a major growth initiative that we were launching, and we had talked about it, plotted and scheming, doing all these sorts of things, working it up. We kind of announced it, and it was a big thud in the organization. Nobody really got it. And we began to go, well, why is that? We did all this work on it. And they said, well, there's a few people on your leadership team that aren't involved, aren't on the same page with you guys. And until you deal with that, we don't believe that you're genuine about what you want to do, because we wanted to make this improvement and this improvement. We want to do all these sorts of things. And the organization kind of said, until you deal with the stuff that's really obvious to us, we're not going to believe you're serious about where you want to go. It's a powerful message for us. It wasn't just the words or the marketing presentation that we wanted to make. It was the actions that we needed to take as leaders to demonstrate we were serious about the direction that we wanted to go. Leadership matters. Nothing changes until the leader changes. I want to encourage you. I don't necessarily want to challenge you because you all are rising to the challenge just by being here. But I want to encourage you to be leaders and examples for these ideas that we've talked about today, for these principles that have been part of the discussions. I want to challenge you or to encourage you to keep leading. I want to encourage you to be curious about how you can do it better, what you can do new. What's the barrier that you can overcome? What's been slowing you down where you can find a way to get through it? How are you going to believe in people? Express trust. Take the risk of trusting somebody else, of giving someone the respect that they deserve, of recognizing the talents and gifts that God has given each and every person in this room and in this world. And then to be the leader that lives it. Many times people would ask me about my dad or about Jay, and they say, what are they like behind the scenes? And I said, they're the same. What you see is what you get. They're the same people, outside of work or outside of the spotlight as they were when they were at work or in the spotlight. When we express the values at Amway, we talked about the founders' fundamentals, these concepts that Dad and Jay talked about of freedom, family, hope, and reward. Those were some of the ideas that were running around in their mind, but they would articulate everything was surrounded and supported by their faith. And they wanted to live their faith. So when I have a chance to talk about principled entrepreneurship, that's the example I get. Who in your life is counting on you? Someone you know, someone you respect, someone you maybe haven't met yet. Someone's counting on you to express to them, to share the gospel, to share your faith, to share your views, to share a hand, to help them through something that's tough, to share some time. Who in your circle is counting on you to be there for them when they have questions or concerns or when they find themselves in a tough spot? Because I know that it's conferences like this, friends like this, colleagues like this, that can help us all band together. So when people are counting on us, we'll never let them down. We'll be there for them to move forward. And having chances like this to be together to talk about these issues help us all be a little stronger, a little braver, a little more adventurous, to touch more people in a positive way. So thank you for giving me a chance to share a few thoughts with you tonight, and I'll look forward to chatting with Tim a little bit later. Thanks, everybody.